So you're making a new IP, a blank sheet of paper. Yay! Wait, a blank sheet of paper? Oh no! How do you go about the process of establishing a new IP? If you're inside of an existing studio structure, something to at least consider is that your new IP be different enough from the other things that your studio makes so that you're not kind of stepping on each other's toes constantly. At BioWare, you've got Dragon Age and Mass Effect. If you're making a new IP, you want something that isn't relatively normal fantasy with some bells and whistles or relatively normal science fiction. Thus, you get something like Anthem, which is science fantasy. It's science fiction, but it doesn't have space travel. The technology is more magic-y, and it sort of fits in a space all on its own. You could imagine BioWare going into the modern day or urban fantasy, different enough from the two existing established franchises. But if you're not at an existing studio with existing IPs, it's still worth thinking about what the marketplace looks like. Unique isn't always the best. You want players to be able to grab onto something to help their understanding. I made a video about the accessibilities of different kinds of setting, like fantasy or science fiction or steampunk. It's worth taking a look at that as you're starting the process of establishing your new IP. But you found the big box. How much work do you need to put in? This is a place where I feel that a lot of teams can actually get themselves into a ton of trouble, because the instinct might be that you need to build an entire source book of information about the world and about the ruling structure and history going back thousands of years and a knowledge of the history 1,000 years into the future. But the reality is you don't need any of that. And by trying to establish all of that, what you're actually going to do is put a lot of constraints around yourself that you're now going to be stuck with. If you spend too much time and lock down too much, then you are going to end up boxing yourself in ways that you might find are constraining you in the future, and they don't really need to. But you wrote them down in a source book and you kind of tied your hands when you probably shouldn't have. For me, the best way to approach this is an hourglass way. You can go watch my older video about the hourglass for game development, but the idea being focus on the most important thing, bring that as far as you need to answer the questions you need to answer, and then allow that act to force the other questions around to be answered. If you're making a high fantasy IP that is going to start in a small town to just check all the cliche checkboxes, then you probably need to know some stuff about that small town. Where is it? Is it on the seaside? And you're going to need to know a bunch of things about that town. Who lives in that town? In order to answer that question, you're going to need to know what kind of occupations exist in this world. And in order to answer that, you're going to need to know, do we have clerics? And how common are they? Do we have mages? And how common are they? But you're still focused in on that little town that you're spending your game in. You might find that you need to know what's the name of the country that you exist in, what's the political structure of the country as a whole. That's a more shallow piece of information about the broader world. Maybe you need to know how long has this world been around for, but you don't need to know every year of history going back 10,000 years. You end up with this cone of knowledge where you have a very deep amount of knowledge about the place where you actually are, where your game is actually set, but then ever descending amounts of information as you get further out. Most of the time, if you aren't going to tell it to the player, you may not even really need to know the answer to it. You don't need to know who the king was 450 years ago unless this is affecting your game directly. Leave it open so that in the future, when you need an answer for it, it's not been stated, it's not been locked down. You want to leave as many of these questions unanswered as you can get away with. But there are a few things that you kind of do need to establish where your game is going to be. And I think you need to establish the player's interaction with the technological conceit of the world, let's say. In science fiction, there's the concept of hard science fiction versus soft science fiction. Hard science fiction, a lot of time is spent trying to make this be real technology and to make sure that everything that happens as much as possible is plausible. Soft science fiction kind kind of throws those rules out the window. And what I'm talking about isn't quite that dichotomy, it's something slightly different. Consider the following. If your ship is broken down and can't travel faster than light anymore, is it because your space engine is broken and you need to use your space wrench to fix it, but the space wrench is lost, so you're going to put on your space spare tire and limp to the nearest space gas station in order to try to fix it? But oh no, the bad guy actually went to the space gas station and you all get captured. Oh no. The end, which is Empire Strikes Back? Or do you want the players to be engaged in the technological conceit and worrying about the oscillation of your deflector array in order to solve the problem, which is often how Star Trek ends up being? In the one case, you have a very loose relationship with the conceits of the world. The storytelling is in the driver's seat at all time. Everything moves at the speed of plot, and you don't solve a problem with a magic or technological solution. You do something human in order to push the button that solves the problem. The example that I like is in Star Trek, you solve the problem by realigning the deflector dish and doing some sort of technobabble stuff. In Doctor Who, you solve the problem by realigning the deflector dish and doing some technobabble stuff. But the real problem is that there's a monster in the way from you doing that. So is there a monster in the way? Or do you want the player engaging in the conceit itself and really understanding and thinking about the way the world works? And this is a spectrum, and you can exist on almost any point on this spectrum. While books aren't video games, let me use two examples. Harry Potter isn't looking for you to engage in the mechanics of its world, because when you do so, you start asking all these weird questions. Why is there mail delivered by nature's slowest bird when they can literally teleport? Why do you have time traveling devices that you are giving out to elementary school students? What did the wizards do during World War II? It just starts to come apart. That's not the point. On the flip side, someone like Branden Sanderson is a world builder. His books are setting out the rules of how things work. As a result, he's asking the reader to engage in this mechanic. So within any of his series, the magic comes from very clear sources. It's got well-established rules. Perhaps the rules are changing for story reasons, but he is asking the reader to engage in this world building. Now, sometimes because everything he writes is set in the Cosmere, maybe some weird thing comes in from outside of this world and upsets that apple cart to a certain degree. But even that, he's kind of asking you to engage in. So the question here that I'm trying to get at is, do you want people to float along within the world and not think too hard about how everything works together? Or is the workings of your world part of your storytelling? Is that part of what you're asking the player or reader or viewer to engage in? If it's the first, then you are able to get away with pretty loose things. If it's the second, then you probably need to understand your own rules. While you may not reveal them all to your player right away, you might need to have them written down at least. If you have too soft of a relationship with the technological conceit of your game, then you run the risk of giving an 11-year-old the ability to travel through time to take more classes and not really dealing with that massive world-breaking piece of technology throughout the rest of your series. What is going to naturally happen is as your IP exists and hopefully gets many, many games, that relationship is going to harden up because you're going to say something. You're going to establish how magic works, and then you are going to have to kind of live with that decision, and players are going to take note, and it's going to harden up a little bit. So over time, unfortunately, a very loose space opera interaction is going to become more and more weighed down by the weight of its own things that it said in service of the plot. Say as little as you can up front, because you're going to get stuck with stuff anyway. Additionally, in establishing a new IP, one thing that I think you should definitely do right away is establish a thought about what is the primary conceit of the IP or setting or series. This might be something that is not going to live with your IP forever, but it's worth at least starting there. So for Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3, it's all about the relationship between humanity and technology. It's really something else in Andromeda. So Dragon Age has always been about groups and found family and about the overarching corruption that comes with power. Set those things down because those are good things to guide the way that your IP will grow and really how you want to establish things. Additionally, you probably want to set some broad thoughts about what your game looks like. Does it look like Sid Mead, like Mass Effect? Or does it look like Kurosawa in the Northern Renaissance, like Dragon Age Inquisition is trying to look? You're not stuck with that, but it's good to establish a broad canvas that you're working with. And you may decide that you want the theme of your IP and the visual language of your IP to be related, or maybe intentionally in opposition because it makes an interesting dichotomy. Anthem has 3 big rules that are mainly set from a visual aesthetic perspective, but I think some of them come and impact the game design and world building as well. The 3 things are coffee cups and cigarette butts, which means that the world should look lived in and dirty, and like people are using this technology and just keeping it going as best they can, which is a way to separate it from Mass Effect, which is very clean and smooth, and a lot of things look like they just came out of the factory. Number 2, similarly, is there is no mass production. So as much as possible, things should look unique, like they were handcrafted by a magical science fantasy blacksmith in the background, and things should look more like they were one-offs as opposed to punched out of a mass production line. Now, that's not always completely possible in a video game because you're going to stamp some assets around. But as much as possible, no mass production. And then the third, which has the biggest impact on the world building and game design, in addition to being a visual aesthetic thing, is no wheels, which of course makes no particular sense because obviously all the arms and things on the Javelin suits obviously have wheels inside, but you never see a wheeled anything in Anthem, which means that there are big walkers or you have things moved by hand. And that is a major thing that really sets what the game looks like really strongly. This implication that this is a world without wheels. Why do you have striders? Why do you even have giant flying mech suits? Well, this is a world without wheels, so you can't have tanks or semi-trucks. Doesn't really make sense, but it's a science fantasy game, so you've set this rule and you're able to then grow the world around that fact. If you have any sort of super tech or magic, then you want to ask this question. How many sources do you have for that magic? And I think that there are really only 3 or 4 valid answers from my perspective. You can have, well, I guess you could have 0. There is no magic. Everything comes from man's interaction with technology. You're hard science fiction, or you're set in the modern day, or you are making a game in the Neolithic period, and there is no magic, there is no super science, the end. You can have 1, which gives you the advantage of having everything being able to be tied back to a single source. Everything that is magical is done by the Force. The Force has this light side and dark side. You can tie everything back to that. It simplifies the conversation. It sets up interesting challenges and dilemmas. You can have 2, in which case things are automatically in opposition. Arguably, the Force, dark side, and light side is 2, but they're kind of all blended together. The last one that I think is valid is many. Magic comes from many sources. You have blood magic. You have magical rocks where magic comes from. Magic can come from nature. Magic can come from gods. Magic can come from your birth. Magic can come simply by studying really hard. This is how D&D typically works, where magic has a lot of sources. As a result, it's kind of blended across everything. This removes some tools from your toolbox. It's hard to get rid of magic if it comes from a million different places, but it means that you have the ability to introduce new things all the time. The danger of having many be your answer to this question is that if you don't have enough, you end up in something that seems like it's trying to be a few, trying to make sense, trying to lock itself into a certain degree of logic, but it doesn't quite get there. Dragon Age has been in this state for a while, where magic has a bunch of sources, but not enough to quite qualify as many. It has lyrium, but it also has the blight. And sometimes you have magical artifacts that don't seem to involve either of those things. And sometimes you have magic from other sources. So is it 3, lyrium and the fade and the blight? Is it 2 because maybe the fade and the blight are somehow related to each other? Is it 1? And that's what Dragon Age has been spending Inquisition and is going to spend, I suspect, Dreadwolf doing, is collapsing this down. So we go from a few too many to be a fully logical metaphysics, but not enough to be just magic comes from wherever, into something where the gears start to mesh together. So if you are going to have a source of magic or super science, think about that. Where does it come from? Is it one place or 2 places or many places? Try to avoid the a lot but not enough that often can happen, because what you end up with is something that's tantalizingly close to working as a tight source list, but doesn't quite get there. So with a new IP, one of the big things you have to do is onboard new players. Before your game is even out, you have to get people interested in paying attention to your game at all. Now, all games have to go through this, but if you exist in an existing IP, you have a little bit of a shortcut. If your existing IP wasn't very popular, you're often dealing with the same problem. But this is why making your IP understandable with very little information, maybe even seeming a little bit derivative on its surface, can be very helpful. It's helpful that Dragon Age looks like other fantasy games on its surface. It's helpful that Mass Effect looks like a science fiction game on its surface. It's helpful that when you look at Call of Duty, you can tell that, oh, okay, it's kind of army men thing. It's helpful that Red Dead Redemption looks like a Western, because it gets you there really fast, and then you're able to engage without a ton of additional information. That being said, something with a strong enough hook can be pretty different. Steel Rising, which to my eye looks like what if steampunk robots in the French Revolution, is gripping and compelling right off the bat. But even there, you're anchoring it in something that people can understand. You kind of know what the French Revolution looks like, so you'd see, okay, it's French Revolution. Wait a minute, those are robots. So you're able to both ground it and anchor it and subvert it in a single image, which is actually really impressive. It'll be interesting to watch and see how something like that ends up doing. But if you are making an IP which is set on an alien planet, you're playing an alien race, and that alien race are entirely sacks of goo, you're losing a lot of ability to get people engaging in it right off the bat. One thing to keep in mind is you have to actually communicate some of your setting information to the player. Especially in a new IP, they aren't coming in with a knowledge about anything other than preconceived notions about your setting or your world. So you need to teach them everything. And this puts you in a weird place when you start, because in the opening second of the game, the player knowledge and character knowledge are as far apart as they can possibly be. Presumably, your character lives in the world and knows who the king is, knows how common mages are, knows that there's faster than light travel, knows a whole bunch of things, and the player doesn't know any of that, and you have to now start the process of communicating this to the player. And you often end up with things like, as we all know, which is a pretty clunky way to approach it. This is why amnesia for the player is so common, because it does something really powerful. It takes that character knowledge and just shoves it all the way back to 0, so that character knowledge and player knowledge are lined back up again at 0. But you can't always do that, because it becomes a little forced if every single game your studio makes has the main character get bonked on the head and get amnesia and have to have everything explained to them all over again. But you do see attempts to approach this either by having the character have to go through some sort of memory reestablishment, or moving the character from a part of the world that they would be familiar with to a part of the world where they're much less familiar with things, and then you're able to teach them things through that lens. That's something that that Dragon Age does, because you are introducing a bunch of new concepts through the Blight, which is something that the character wouldn't be super familiar with. The more different that your setting is, that your IP is, than what the player is going to understand, the more time and effort you're going to have to take to explain it to them. And that can really affect the pacing of your opening of the game. And you can end up with a lot of forced conversations where you are telling the character in the game things that the player needs to know, but that the character logically would already know. So definitely think about what the player actually needs to know. A major streamlining of Dragon Age Inquisition's opening was done by removing a bunch of information about Red Lyrium from the opening of Dragon Age Inquisition and pushing it later into the game when it was actually relevant to what was going on. Does the player actually need to know this right now? If not, tell them when they need it. Leave as much information out of the intro of your game as you can, because it's going to improve your pacing and fatigue the player a lot less. One thing that's worth doing as your IP goes along and starts to grow and starts to build up these rules is to build yourself an IP Bible. An IP Bible is basically just a document or a wiki or whatever that lists the rules of your IP. If you have decided that you do not have teleportation, like Dragon Age has, that is something that should be in your IP Bible. Now, you might decide that you're going to go right up to the edge of that rule without quite breaking it, which is what's been happening in gameplay for Dragon Age for a while. Put it down. Ideally, put down the reason for that. You don't want to have teleportation because it is too easy to be used to break plots, because you can just teleport into the crypt and then teleport out, which then also allows you to understand the spirit and allows you to go up to the edge of that rule without breaking it. Oh, okay, so since the reason is that we don't want people to break plots through teleportation, using something that's very teleportation-like in combat is okay. It breaks the letter of the law, but doesn't break the spirit of the law. Similarly, Dragon Age has the rule that any sort of enchantment magic is seen as incredibly evil, as being one of the most evil forms of magic. Put that in your IP Bible. If all paper has the corners cut off, a la the new Battlestar Galactica, then put that in your IP Bible. Things that are visual, things that are rules, things that are thematic. If you have a rule that everything needs to involve a team, that should be in your IP Bible. This is useful for your team because they will understand the rules that they need to be careful about following, or if they're breaking them on purpose. But it also gives you something to give to external parties that are making movies or making t-shirts that keeps them on track. And it gives, ideally, reasons for why, and it just helps you in the discussion with these other organizations. And frankly, having an IP Bible kind of makes you look a bit more professional and is going to make them a bit more interested in working with you in the first place. TLDR, the way to start making a new IP is honestly to not stress about it so much. Set down a few easy rules around broad themes, broad visuals, and then hourglass this thing. Focus on the questions you need to answer just the questions you need to answer, leave as much open for the future as is possible, and that is gonna serve you pretty well. Don't worry so much about potentially being a little bit derivative, because your game will end up being different all by itself. And I guess don't stress about this too much. Special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have merch now. I'm wearing my buy a shirt or I'm going to start pumping NFTs shirt. There's a shelf below this video for that as well, if you want to buy a shirt and keep me from pumping NFTs. What do you think? Do you think IPs are more intricate than I am implying? Do you think you need to stress about this? Let me know that down in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, because that helps YouTube know that it's worth sharing with more people. Also, any comments that you leave also increase the engagement and also help spread this to more people. So think about doing that. I will see you again soon. Thank you.